Well, how's your mind going? Mine's going okay. We're going to take a look at Proverbs today. We're in Proverbs chapter 15, verse 6. Let's jump right in. Beit Sadiq Hotzen Rav Ubit Buat Rasa Neka Ret. So Beit would be house. So in the house, Zadik, we've had before, righteous. In the house of the righteous, there is treasure. There's a adjective. There is treasure much, so much treasure. In the house of the righteous, there is much treasure. And then we have the vav, but in the revenue, let's look at this word here. This is a little interesting. What's it come from? This word is tabu'ah, product, revenue, crops, harvest, produce. Let's see here. So we have bait is very clearly house, right? So I think the word that we're kind of hinging on here is not house, but treasure, right? So in the, maybe we could think of it like the place where the righteous are, there is much treasure, but in the but basically like wicked people produce much trouble. So righteous people, where they dwell, there's treasure, but wicked people produce trouble. How does the ESV translate it? In the house of the righteous there is much treasure, but trouble befalls the income of the wicked. I think the idea here would be, like a righteous person begets a monetary blessing or earthly blessing. This is really confusing when you contrast it with Christ saying things like, truly I tell you, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to inherit the kingdom of God. And then he says you can't love God and money. But in those circumstances, especially the second one, the people have turned money into an idol. The money is going to produce the money, or protect, care for. The money will take care of me, right? So you've turned the money into an idol. So a righteous person can love the Lord and have monetary blessings. Happens all the time. I have known several people in my life who are just absolutely wonderful, righteous, God-loving people, and they're also monetarily blessed. And then they listen to what Paul says about a variety of gifts and know that since they've been blessed monetarily, one of their gifts that they can then turn around and use is, that they can give gifts and support ministries, other people, needs of the church, things like that. They see their money as a means to serve the Lord, not as something that will take care of me. Like, see what I'm saying? Like if you're always putting your trust in the Lord that He's going to take care of me, He's going to protect me, He's going to be the one that loves me, or that provides for me in every circumstance, right? So you can be rich today, and then 10 years from now you cannot be rich. Well, your riches won't support you then, 10 years down the road. So a God-fearing, and I might add an intelligent rich person, will realize that all money, all riches, all blessings are fleeting, are temporary, but the Lord is forever, and His blessings are forever, right? So the righteous person, and I think that's the key of the verse there. Then the person is righteous, and so they are blessed. The righteousness would be a fear and knowledge of the Lord. In other words, true worship and fear of the Lord, and so they are blessed monetarily. But just because someone's blessed monetarily doesn't necessarily mean that they're righteous. So you can be righteous and be blessed monetarily, it is possible to be rich monetarily and not be righteous. I mean, that does happen. Um, but what we see here is that the the production, the produce of the wicked, so like a righteous person kind of has treasure, then a wicked person, their produce is troubled. And one way I could point at this would be, uh, I have noticed in life that when I have dealt with people in ministry who are not tithing in any meaningful way, they're not giving to the Lord in any meaningful way, that they seem to have additional money problems. Now, money problems happen for a variety of reasons. I mean, they happen because people don't plan well. They happen because of, well, circumstance, right? Like you um, have medical problems or bankruptcy problems, business problems. There are problems that are forced upon you from the outside world, like inflation, or maybe you're in some kind of industry where suddenly a new form of oversight comes down, and now your business becomes untenable. It just doesn't work anymore. That happens, you know. Um, so there are things that are out of your control. But I have noticed that people who don't practice good stewardship inevitably have difficulty with money in general in life. Um, and then we can talk about like uh, Ponzi scheme kind of fellows. People who are do wicked things with money. They end up having a lot of troubles, right? Because if you're doing everything above board, you're not worrying about the government per se coming after for taxes or for illegalities or fines or things like that. But if you're wicked and you're doing all sorts of things, you're going to deal with these kinds of results. Now, this culture, the kind of tax implications and things that we have now, that would not have been the issue. I think the issue more at hand is like if you work with people who are wicked, i.e., criminals, don't be surprised when they turn around and cause problems in your production or your accumulation of wealth, right? So in other words, if you're hiring a bunch of, like, if your business is you've hired a bunch of robbers to rob people along the way, which was a common problem in Israel. Jesus talks about it in the Good Samaritan parable. So let's say hypothetically that's your business. You hire people to rob people along the way. Well, don't be surprised when the people that you've hired to rob you, or lie, or cheat, right? Or they keep a portion back. If you ever watch like gangster style movies, like about the mob and things like that, people are always skimming, right? So you hire criminals to do criminal activity, and then they give you a portion back at the top. And then somehow the guy at the top is irritated that the people at the bottom are doing unethical things, skimming from his cut. It's like, well, you're hiring criminals. What exactly do you expect? That they're not gonna that the people you hire to do criminal acts are not going to continue to do criminal acts in every sector of their life. Well, that's silly, right? So you associate, you deal with wicked people. They're going to do wicked things. That's what wicked people do. And when wicked people do wicked things, obviously it's going to impact your bottom line. So maybe this proverb is kind of a suggestion, like, hey, if you have a choice between hiring, maybe not as productive, like if that's the thing, like not as productive, but honest workers, or hiring dishonest workers, hire honest workers because you're going to have fewer troubles. Yeah. I don't know. There's a lot there. Let's continue on. I did want to make a note. So I'm right up here on camera. You're probably noticing I got a little I was working in the yard yesterday and I got hit by a tree branch and it gave me a pretty good wallop in the nose. So that's why I've got this little scar here. So just do your best to ignore it. Verse 7. Sipteh hakamim yetzaru da'at velev kesalim lo ken. Okay, so we have hakamim is the wise. I think that's it's interesting here. I mean, I think we would probably translate like the lips of the wise. So the wise would kind of become the subject of the sentence, but in the Hebrew, the noun is the lips. So probably like the most wooden translation would be something like wise lips disperse knowledge, right? How does the ESV translated? See, it does the lips of the wise. So they're, I mean, that feels like the way that we would translate it, but I mean, woodenly, very, because the noun is actually lips, and then the wise is actually an adjective, right? So the lips of the wise, or wise lips, right? Like how we would do an adjective and noun, wise lips, disperse knowledge. So that makes sense. I've always said that I think the key to a good teacher is someone who, when they receive knowledge or wisdom, their first, what's the word? Their first desire is to then share that, right? And I think that's a sign of a great teacher is that they just, I think every teacher that I've ever enjoyed learning from is a teacher who's genuinely excited about knowledge, excited about learning. They like learning themselves. They like learning new things. And then when they learn about new things, they're excited about sharing new things, right? So, someone who's wise, it shouldn't surprise us that knowledge comes forth, right? So in other words, you don't learn knowledge, you don't learn wisdom to keep it all to yourself. I think this would be the key office of like a rabbi. This is what a rabbi does, right? They accumulate wisdom over life and then they disperse it to their students, right? And this is why Jesus is called a rabbi, and this is what he does. Although there was one difference between Jesus and the other rabbis, which is why they talk about Jesus having one. He's like one who has authority. The reason they say that is because typically you would go through a process of learning, as kind of a school process. You'd study underneath a rabbi long enough until you could kind of hang out your own shingle and then be a rabbi yourself. Jesus never does this, right? He just has wisdom because, as we've learned in Proverbs, he is wisdom. The fear and knowledge of the Lord. He is the physical embodiment, as the incarnate Son of God of wisdom. Like, so whenever we hear wisdom here, it's confusing too because in the Proverbs, wisdom is often talked about as a female. Like, wisdom calls, but I think it has to do with the relationship between Proverbs is kind of very much aimed at young men, right? Because young men typically are ones who don't have wisdom, who don't have knowledge. So this wisdom is beckoning in young men like a woman would, right? But not just kind of leave all the sexual things aside and think about it like, no, God is trying to call in young men to better things, to learn at the feet of wisdom and to become a wise man. So, I would imagine that Proverbs is not necessarily aimed at, of course it is, but at the same time, I think the primary audience would be young men, as opposed to old men who hopefully already have wisdom because they've been learning for a long time. They've been, hearing the stories of God, hearing the gospel. When I say gospel, like the good news of forgiveness in the Old Testament, all the good things from God in the Old Testament for a very long time. So they already have wisdom, you'd think. So it makes sense then that this kind of relationship of wisdom calling in young men is depicted as a female as opposed to a male. But I think when we read about wisdom and what wisdom is, and there's a couple of times in the lectionary where the 1 year and the 3 year lectionary kind of almost makes a point of this. It pulls out this wisdom section when Jesus is teaching with wisdom and authority, right? Trying to draw that connection that he is the embodiment of wisdom, right? So the lips of the wise, if Jesus, if we want to kind of jump to Christ, what does Christ do? I mean, my goodness, he will teach anyone who will listen. There comes a time where he's taught long enough, where the Pharisees have rejected him long enough. He kind of stops teaching them, focuses on his disciples. But the first 2 years of his ministry, until the kind of the tail end of it, he's interested in teaching anyone who will come out to him and listen. Unfortunately, the Pharisees are there. The Pharisees, the scribes, the rulers of the temple, the ones who come to him, they usually aren't coming to him for knowledge. Like when Nicodemus comes, Christ teaches him, and it's a very back and forth dialogue kind of thing. But oftentimes people come out to him, they're looking to entrap him in something he said. They want him to say something specific. The classic example would be, do you pay taxes on the Caesar or not? And they've got it set up where either Jesus says, don't pay taxes to Caesar. Well, now he is a Jewish usurper. Or pay taxes to Caesar. Well, now he's not a real Jew, but he's just a Roman lackey. Either way, Jesus's answer will anger somebody, right? Kind of how cable news does their shtick, right? There's one of two answers as opposed to us actually having a dialogue, which is irritating. It's irritating to watch. Like, we can't talk about the truth. We just pick sides and then we cast stones at one another. It's very stupid. So, Jesus, he isn't asked for knowledge often by the Pharisees and those types. They're usually looking more to trap him. Makes sense. The lips of the wise, or why, maybe like, I don't see a definite article. I think we're doing a definite article because it's on the lips noun. So in other words, wise as opposed to the wise, which is why I think I'm guessing the ESV translates it the lips of the wise because they're putting a definite article on wise. So in other words, it brings out a subtle nuance, right? Wise lips kind of is more vague. The lips of the wise is more specific. So we're saying like lips on wise people disperse knowledge, as opposed to wise lips. I don't know where they're from, but they disperse knowledge. Probably the ESV way of ESV usually is pretty good, but I think you see it either way, and it's not a ton of difference either way either. But it sounds a little more normal in English. Wise lips disperse knowledge as opposed to the lips of the wise. So that sounds a little more natural in English. Okay, so now we have the second part of verse 7. Velev kisalim lo ken. So lev we've had before. That's heart, right? So, but the heart, kesalim, we've also had before. We've actually had it a bunch of times. Kesalim is a foolish one, right? So but the heart of the foolish one does not do so. So a wise person disperses what they have to the world. A foolish person keeps it to themselves. The ESV translates it something like this: the lips of the wise spread knowledge, not the hearts of fools. Yeah. What does that mean exactly? Like, what does it mean for a foolish person, or why is a person foolish because they don't spread wisdom? Perhaps it's one of two things. A foolish person doesn't have a lot of wisdom, doesn't have a lot of basis in order of which to share things because they're a fool. So they don't have a lot of wisdom to share. And I think also too that wisdom comes from the Lord. So we would understand that wisdom is unlimited. There's no limits to how much wisdom there are in the world because the Lord is the one who's offering it, right? So in other words, should we view wisdom as a limited resource? The answer is no. And then by extension, right, which is what verses 7 is saying, is should we be afraid to share wisdom, right? On this, we could even be talking about maybe evangelism, right? Sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Should we be afraid of sharing good news? No, because there's plenty of it. There is more than enough to share. We don't need to worry about it being a finite resource, right? But a foolish person would look at wisdom and see it as power, and see it as being like a limited resource. Maybe because I have a lot of experience with wisdom, i.e., they don't have a lot of smart friends, they're not very smart themselves or wise, so they think of this, well, this is a limited resource. If I kind of hold on to this little bit of wisdom, maybe I have knowledge of how to make money. Maybe I have knowledge of like what stock to buy. Maybe I have some kind of secret knowledge of something to invest in. I mean, I'm not being very creative here, but you get the idea. So if I'm a foolish person and I have some secret piece of knowledge, maybe what horse is going to win at the horse track, I keep it to myself. God forbid I share with other people, because it'll make it worth less. And in the horse track thing, that actually works out, because the more people that bet on a horse that wins, the less, I believe, the lesser of the payout, right? So if you let out to the world that, like, because the way the casino sets those odds, I think that if there's a lot of money on one horse, then the odds will start going down. In other words, what you can potentially win, right? So it really fits in here, right? Like the idea, well, I'll keep this secret knowledge myself, and um, it's going to be of value to me to keep it to myself as opposed to share it. And that might actually work out in the world. Like maybe you do have a secret piece of knowledge and you win more money. Long term, though, the best thing for the world, just purely practical, not even talking about spiritual, but just practical. The best thing for the world is for us to share our wisdom, share our knowledge with one another. This is a good thing for all of society, and I think we're beginning to see it even now with how the economy has changed, and people share like open source software and things like this. That there's enough money to have people make money, but what's better for the world in general is for these things to be shared, right? That we can, as a people, as a human race, succeed together. That might be pie in the sky stuff. And I think too that like if we're talking about this, maybe like put aside making money or wisdom of the world, wisdom of God, right? In Egyptian theology, which is where Moses kind of gets it from, is this idea that if I know my God's name, I have control over him. So often this would be a secret and only certain people knew, right? But then God flips that around and he's like, you want my name? I'll give you my name. Use it whenever you want. Call upon it, pray, praise, and give thanks. I want you to have it. I want you to have my name to call upon me in every trouble. So he gives us the name Yahweh, right? I mean, God turns that on its heel. And so should we be like God or like our fellow man? Should we hold things to ourselves and hope that if we know something special, we have special power over people? Or should we just turn around and share everything equally and openly like our God does? I would probably go to the latter. Yeah. Verse 8. Zeba resaim to'obat Yahweh uta pilat yesarim reso ono. So Zeba resaim. Resaim is wicked. We've had that word before. The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to Yahweh. You know, these words are used almost word for word in Isaiah, right? Your sacrifices are detestable to me. They're an abomination. Well, I mean, let's just really. I want to read that to you real quick. Beginning of Isaiah, the Lord sets out a very bleak situation that the people are being judged, right? Because they're just kind of going through the motions. And we get into chapter 6. No, that's Isaiah's call narrative. You got to go backwards. Chapter 5. Here's some examples. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness into light, darkness for light, and light for darkness. And then let's see if I can find it. Let's see here. Okay. Now we're getting close. Something like this. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. He's speaking to Judah here, the southern kingdom of Judah. Give ears to your teaching of our God, you people of Gomorrah. So he's insulting them, calling them Sodom and Gomorrah. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of well fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goat. When you come to appear before me, who is required of you this trampling of my courts? Your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hates. They become a burden to me. I'm weary of bearing them. Okay, uh, so there's what's going on is they go through the motions. They're doing all the stuff, but they can't do basic stuff like take care of the poor and not persecute the weak, right? So it's like, well, I don't care if you do the sacrifices if your life doesn't uh, bear out fruit of any kind that you're actually faithful people, right? So it shouldn't surprise us then um, that the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination. You know, and I wonder too, like, so Aaron tries his best to make the golden calf celebration. He tries to baptize it and make it look as good as possible. He calls it a festival to the Lord, but eventually they start. I mean, we understand when they start talking about like dancing and cavorting that like probably sexual stuff's going on and it's not good and it's public, and basically a large public orgy is what it is. It's not good, you know. Um, and by the way, this is I think one of the prime reasons why God doesn't want us to form into large cities. Because if we're spread out and we're with our families, so incest has already been outlawed, right? So since Sinai, incest is not a good thing. God doesn't like it. And then if we're not allowed to live close enough to have problems like the golden, like because part of what makes the golden calf happen is they're all gathered together at the bottom of Mount Sinai. They're all there. They're proximity, right? Well, if we're all spread out, there's less of a chance of this stuff happening. I mean, I'm not saying it's the only reason, but I think it's a reason why God wanted us to spread out. Uh, what do you say? He wants us to be fruitful and multiply, spread out, and take dominion over the whole earth. He wants us to be further apart from one another, which makes sense. I mean, in general, when we're all gathered and squeezed together, it just seems like we're rubbing elbows with people who are like us, and that's not always good, right? If you're a criminal and you're rubbing elbows with other criminals, obviously that's not good. Whereas if your life is more desolate in terms of like being alone, and your relationship then with God becomes more pronounced, right? You spend more time with God, you spend more time worshiping God because you don't have as many other relationships to distract you, right? This is what God wants. Nevertheless, uh, so I have a question of verse 8. Like, is God here talking about sacrifices to foreign gods or to false gods, or is he talking about sacrifices to him? So in other words, do wicked people make sacrifices to Yahweh? I think the answer to that is unequivocally yes. We know what happens because God was telling us in Isaiah 5, right? It's like you're coming to me and bringing me offerings that I couldn't care less about. I mean, meanwhile you're oppressing the weak, the poor, the widow, the orphan. So obviously, this is along the scale of wickedness. Now, would we consider this person as being like wicked to the sense of being like you're outside of the community, you're not part with God, you're not faithful at all? Like, so in other words, can a person be faithful and be a Christian and still do wicked things? I think the answer is yes. We know that to be true. Um, so I don't know in that scenario, is God saying that everyone who does wicked stuff, they're no longer a child of God or a believer? I don't. Maybe not. Maybe it's possible to do wicked stuff but still be one of God's children. Change your ways, repent. um, I think that's the primary thing here. It could be though that like wicked people outside the camp are offering sacrifices to their gods, and Yahweh finds that to be an abomination. And actually, both things are true. Yahweh does not like people making sacrifices to Moloch or to Baal or Ashtoreth. These are an abomination to God, but also wicked people making maybe sacrifices in the temple to God, but still practicing wickedness, basically being wicked in every sense of their life, except for the sacrifice. Well, that's an abomination to God as well. So the end of the sentence goes, but the prayer, Yesarim, of the upright is his delight. And I can't help but think about the second commandment. You shall not take the Lord's name in vain. You should fear and love God, so do not lie, cheat, curse, or swear by God's name, but call upon it in every trouble, pray, praise, and give thanks. Luther nails the second part. I want to make sure I think I actually didn't say that right, and that's embarrassing because I should know that. I didn't word it quite right. So what do we have here? Should fear and love God. So not curse, swear, use satanic arts. That's what I missed. Lie or deceive by his name. Call upon every trouble, pray, praise, and give thanks. So God desires for people to call upon his name in prayer. He wants us to talk to him. We see that in both the second commandment meaning, but we also see that in the Lord's Prayer discussion in the Catechism as well, that the Lord is our Father and he desires to hear us. If he is our Father, we are his children. What father doesn't want to hear from his children in every situation? Of course, our Father is greater than our earthly fathers, so it's even more the case that he wants to hear us regardless of what things we are offering or bringing to him, right? So, in other words, we might think, oh, our prayers are nothing but, whining and complaining. It's like, well, but our Father is good and patient, merciful, full of steadfast love. He wants to hear from us. I always say when teaching prayer to the catechism of kids, though, it's not a bad thing to maybe consider your situation. Remember that God's holy and you're not. So maybe start off with, asking for forgiveness, perhaps then thinking about, well, look at the ways in which God has blessed us already, being mindful of his blessings. And then I think once you go through those two thought processes, it kind of prepares you and makes you ready to ask in the right mindset. Because sometimes we can get very just, I'm going to pray to God only when I need stuff, right? And our prayers get kind of out of kilter. So the Lord, this is actually very reassuring, right? This is telling us that the Lord delights in our prayer, right? And this is the very word of God. It's inspired by the Holy Spirit. So we know that it's God saying this himself. He's telling us, hey, I want to hear from you. Your prayers are my delight. I want to talk to you. Which is amazing. Like what you think about David then, like what is man, right? He's a little lower than all earthly beings, and yet you raise him up and you speak to him like this. This doesn't make any sense. I want to yeah, let's see here. I want to read it to you just to have it. Psalm 8. What is man that you are mindful of him? So in other words, like, what is man? He's not much, and you still consider us. You still think about us. You still listen to us. What is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him. You made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. So you made him a little lower. Maybe the heavenly beings, he's talking about angels here, or even the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. You made a little lower than heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. Like, why? For what reason? What purpose? Well, David's also aware that we're sinful and not worthy really of anything. So it's this amazing thing. Like, why do you listen to us at all? And not that God's going to give us an answer that we necessarily have one, but it's not. I don't think it's bad to go into prayer and just kind of maybe think about that, ask that question a little bit. Like, what is man that you're mindful of him? And thanks be, and then just praise. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God that you listen to us at all. We don't deserve it, but we are blessed. Okay. So, verse 9, Toabat, Yahweh, Derek, Rasa, Ume, Radep, Zedekah, Yehav. Um, so the noun here is the way, Derek. By the way, if anyone's named Derek, isn't that a fun thing? I don't know if you knew that, but your name in Hebrew means the way. Yeah. So, Derek, Rasa, the way of the wicked, is an abomination to Yahweh. But him who follows Zedekah, righteousness, he loves. And the he here is Yahweh. Yahweh loves, right? Now, let's be clear that justification is a separate issue from this, right? How are we justified or made right before God? And the answer is God makes a eternal sacrifice for us in the form of Jesus Christ. The great high priest offers himself as a sacrifice for sin to wipe us clean, to balance the scales, so to speak, and to make us righteous. Okay. However, doing righteous in the world, remember, Luther is very good about saying this, is our works are not for ourselves, but rather our works are for our neighbor. So doing righteousness is still important in the world, not for our salvation, but for our neighbors. I mean, perhaps their salvation or just their neighbor's life, right? How do we love or honor our neighbor? We do righteousness, righteous things. We follow the Ten Commandments, right? So, I mean, you pick a commandment. The fourth commandment? Honor your parents, serve and obey them, parents and other authorities, and love and cherish them. I mean, this is good stuff for society and the Christian church, and even for you, right? You shall not murder, but help and support our neighbor in every physical need. I mean, so in other words, like, how does one do righteousness? I think by following the Ten Commandments. Who does one do righteousness to? To your neighbor. Why? Because it's good for your neighbor. I put my neighbor's needs before my own. Has nothing to do with my own justification. That was dealt with by God. But I do righteous things to my neighbor because he needs them. It's good for him. And thanks be to God, it's a way for me to show service and love to God. Like, Luther makes a point to talk about this ad nauseum. I could make my whole life about prayer and worship. I could worship all day long. I could pray all day long. But the only person that benefits from that situation is me. So in fact, it's actually very selfish. How do I do righteous? In other words, how do I show thanks for what God's given me? Well, I serve my neighbor. I understand my life and its various vocations as a father, pastor, son, right? And then I serve those people in those vocations to show God thanks and praise for everything he's done for me, right? But at the end of the day, I show righteousness for what he's done for me, but he's the one who justifies me. I can't justify myself. It's impossible. What the scriptures is telling us then is serving my neighbor delights the Lord. He wants you to serve your neighbor. He wants you to do good things for people in the world because that's what he did, right? So in a very, very small way, it's like There's nothing that warms my heart more when I'm out working on some project and Eli comes out with his little toy hammer and he's hammering alongside me. And he really has no idea what he's doing. He can't really affect that project or make it go any faster. But there's nothing that is so heartwarming than seeing my son try to copy me and be like me. Right now, of course, these things are not the same for God, but can you kind of understand? Like, we do righteousness, and they're not necessarily necessary. God doesn't need us to make good things happen in the world. They'll happen with or without us. But it's this wonderful way that we can show him that we love him as our Father, that we want to do these things, that we want to be about the same business that his son was about, that he's about, right? We want to be in the family business, so to speak, and show love and praise to the God who did everything for us, right? Who justified us and pulled us out of sin. So he loves righteousness. I think this would go alongside the idea of like, well done, good and faithful servant, right? You serving the Lord. So, last verse 10. Mutsar ra laotsev ora saon taokahat yamut. Okay, I'm gonna go with this. Discipline is the noun in the sentence here. So something like harsh discipline, like, I don't know, harsh discipline happens to the one who forsakes the way. How does the ESV translate it? There's severe discipline for him who forsakes the way. Yeah, so there, harsh discipline is for him who forsakes the way, and he who hates correction will die. So here's one where there's no vav that is a conjunction. What would be the word too? Not a positive. So when we have and, it connects those two phrases together that they're similar. When we have but, it connects those two phrases together that one is different from another. So here we have the latter. We have two that are the same thing, which, if you've been paying attention at all in this chapter, all of the Proverbs have been opposing. This is the first one where they kind of run together. So there is harsh discipline for him who forsakes the way, and he who hates correction will die. And I think correction we could understand to be like criticism, constructive criticism. So in other words, you're in catechism and your pastor's trying to teach you, and you completely reject everything he's trying to say. Or you're a child and you reject everything your parents say, right? If you reject any kind of wisdom or insight, any kind of criticism or correction, your life is going to be very difficult, because people usually speak from a place of wisdom and understanding. Like when I talk to my kids about various situations, I talk from a place of experience. I've experienced these things. I know what's going to happen if you keep going down this road. So you talk about it, you try to explain it to them. And usually, if they're smart, they'll listen. But the occasional, very stubborn, unwilling to be criticized or chided in any way, they reject this, and it leads to bad things. We go back to this idea that if you consort with criminals, don't be surprised if you get criminal activity. If you reject wisdom consistently, if you reject correction or criticism consistently, don't be surprised when it leads to, very grave circumstances, even death. And that actually makes a ton of sense. Like, if you're thinking about being a parent and your kids getting involved in criminal activities, or maybe your kid's dabbling in drugs, and that kid refuses to hear any wisdom or insight, that's not going to lead to good things, right? Maybe even death. So that makes quite a bit of sense there in chapter 10. Of course, we can also understand it spiritually. Any child who rejects discipline and correction, criticism of any sort in a churchly sense, right? Um, can lead to very dangerous situations where what they reject the faith, uh, or they have a very stilted idea of what the faith is, which is playing with fire, right? You may have very bad ideas about heaven and hell, and you're going to meet your maker, and you're not going to be prepared. So, well, that's it. 5 verses, 6 through 10. Glad to have you today. I hope you have a chance to, if you're not from here in Sioux Falls, or if you're not part of my congregation, on Sunday go to church, and you'll do your pastor a very good work, right? He'll love to have you there. He'll be glad you're there. Go to church, as well as attend Bible study. Listen to the words that he's teaching you. He'll be very thankful for that as well. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and the Lord bless and keep you.